we were talking about the High Renaissance, which is this culmination of everything that started with Giotto. That is often given the dates of sort of the late 15th century, so 1490-ish, although Botticelli is kind of an outlier there, through around 1520. And we'll talk later, probably next week, about what happens after around 1520. But it's sort of the culmination of everything we've seen, this revival of interest in ancient Rome, which brings with it an extraordinary sense of rationality, right? Interest in Neoplatonism comes out of that, right? We were talking about their interest in sort of the rational mind as the place where perfection exists versus the messy world around us, the chaotic world around us. But also this interest in sort of forms, body types that are derived from ancient Roman examples, and often sort of moving not only from the realism that we see, but also moving from there into actual body types and poses, and then moving from that to actual subject matter, like we saw with Botticelli, although Christian subject matter doesn't go away, right? So from this whole Renaissance idea, things are really coming to fruition. And for Leonardo, right, he loves to study nature, but at the same time he sort of applies this ideal to it as he's looking at it, and it becomes sort of this strangeness for him that we're part of in a way, but at the same time above, at the same time. So with these two works were done after he had left his hometown of Florence, right? His hometown is Vinci, but the town where he grew up, right, was Florence. And as we've seen, up to this point, really Florence is the epicenter of the Renaissance. It's the major city. And he had left Florence around 1482 to work for the Duke of Milan, to become his court painter for the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. And he has a number of projects that he does for Sforza. These are the two most prominent Sforza projects that have survived. One of them included a 35-foot equestrian statue of, Ludovico on a horse riding into battle. And it was never completed. Typical, right? Never really completed. He ended up, Leonardo, making the clay model for it, but never cast it in bronze as he planned. And it was actually destroyed in the 1490s when Milan was invaded by the French. They used it for target practice, right? Shot it to pieces. Sadly, so we have some of the drawings is all that survived from that, right? But he's got lots of little projects he's working on for Sforza. These are the two most important artistic ones. So we looked at the Madonna of the Rocks, which was done for this brotherhood that Sforza belonged to, that was dedicated to the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, right? The fact that she was born from a virgin just as her son Jesus was born from a virgin, thus she did not carry original sin from Eve, right? And for Leonardo to conceptualize this, what he's done is he's put her sort of in this grotto, and she seems to emerge with his sfumato lighting, right? She seems to emerge out of that shadow, as if she's sort of one with the earth in a way. And for Leonardo, that's a nice way of conceiving of these religious mysteries, right? And then the Last Supper, which we wound up talking at the end of class about, was done for a monastery that Sforza supported financially, right? Paid for, which is again a common Renaissance idea, going back to Philip the Bold of Burgundy or Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. Both had supported monasteries financially, and Sforza does as well. And this particular work decorated the place where the monks ate, the refectory, right? So there's the refectory. Whoop, okay. Try that again. There's the refectory where the monks ate, right? And this is sort of where we left off. By the way, Last Supper images are usually most common in places where monks ate. That's the normal subject matter that one would choose for that, with the idea that you always dine with Jesus, every meal is a remembrance of the last meal he shared with his apostles. as I mentioned at the end of class, and this is the last thing we talked about, was that it was almost destroyed in World War II, right? We had this group called the Monuments Men who warned our troops about what they should try not to destroy, and it would also surreptitiously warn the wardens of works of art if things might be in danger. And many of them were sandbagged to keep from being destroyed as the Allied air strikes hit, right? And I found some pictures, right? So there's the sandbagging of it, and I sort of overlaid it with the transparency on here, right? So it was sandbagged, and this is in process. They built a huge metal scaffolding over the sandbag, and there's the room, right? That's the Last Supper wall on the right. You can see the same windows there, right? And it survived because it was sandbagged. So it's sort of extraordinary that it's still around, right? Even though, as we mentioned, it had already started to fall apart really almost in Leonardo's own lifetime because he was experimenting with technique. Leonardo was a restless experimenter. He was always experimenting, he was always observing, and was always sort of taking notes on things. And which is good for us as college students, right? I think I'm still kind of a college student in a weird way, right? I never really got out of here. But part of education and part of what we hope happens with education is you become lifelong learners, right? And part of being a lifelong learner is that you're never satisfied with the answers that you have. And that as you continue with your life, you continue to question things, and especially question the conventions that have been handed down to you, the pat answers that people give for things. You should always ask why. Are we sure? Do I really buy into this? And Leonardo was doing that with his entire life, right? He was going back and investigating again and again and again the way that knowledge had been handed down to him, and whether or not he actually agreed, and doing his own observations on this, right? So cutting up cadavers and taking notes, right? Studying rock formations, clouds in the sky, right? It just was never satisfied with simply what he'd been told. And when it comes to the fresco process, right, he wasn't satisfied there either. He had thought knew a better way. And even though he's probably, I would argue, one of the most brilliant men that ever walked the planet, very few people could match as many things he was good at. He could also be wrong. And he thought he knew a better way to do fresco, which was to put oil paint over the top of it. And it just didn't adhere, right? And so you can just see in Christ's robe just above the plate, right, the degree to which we've lost so much of this, right? And it's been gone over with conservators, most recently about 20 years ago, that have sealed down the last remaining bits and making sure that it's going to stick so that, by your death, it'll look as good as it does now, which is only a ghost of itself. But even our old friend Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists, Giorgio Vasari, when he wrote about the Last Supper in 1550, 1560, he already said it's a wreck, right? There's nothing much left of it. So it was really falling apart pretty quickly. Sadly. So we really don't know the crispness of how it originally looked. We just have this sort of ghost, this faint ghost. Before we go there. So behind Christ's head, we have three windows, and you can see above his head, there's a bit of an architectural half dome, right? Can you see that at the very top, sort of within the ghost, right? And that half dome forms a sort of natural halo around Christ, if you will. Leonardo doesn't like halos. He doesn't like things he can't see. He likes working through these ideas visually. And so what he's done for Christ is to give him a sort of earth as a halo, if you will, or a constructed halo out of natural elements. Not only do we have the three windows like we saw with Van Eyck in the Annunciation as a symbol for the Trinity, right? The Christian idea of the three. But in addition to that the light of the world becomes sort of the light of Christ's halo. And the circle of the traditional halo is picked up by this architectural detail around the top. And I've heard said, and I don't know if it's really true or not, I'd have to sort of get out a compass and see, that it's actually Christ's eye is the epicenter of the halo of the circle. And Leonardo writes about the human eye and the importance of observation. And it would be an interesting thing if that were really true, right? if you could trace that out. I just tried to do this as best I can. This isn't even Photoshop, right? This is just PowerPoint. So it's not, my circle ain't accurate, right? That idea that we can trace a circle based on the architecture sort of around the head of Jesus is picked up by other sort of mathematical and geometrical elements to the composition. So, for example, you'll notice that Jesus makes this sort of perfect equilateral triangle as he puts his hands out to the side. So the moment is when he's telling his apostles, one of you will betray me, right? You know the story? One of you, and he said, and they all thought, who, right? And the answer is the one who dips his bread in the soup with me, right, or in the wine, sops his bread with me is the one that will betray me. This is where he reveals to the apostles that Judas is going to be the bad guy, right? So it's the moment of the proclamation, right? Judas hasn't been fully revealed yet. And as he puts his arms out to the side and say this to the apostles, right, he becomes this triangle, right? This underscoring, if you will, this basis of the composition, this geometry. And we could trace these sorts of triangles around other things. The Madonna of the Rocks becomes a sort of nice equilateral triangle of a composition that gives it stability and permanence, but also reflects this Renaissance interest in mathematics and geometry. These are mental concepts, right? Geometry doesn't really exist in the world. Mathematics is an abstract, right? But they're here, and they help us to give reason and rationality and purpose to the world. They help us understand things, but it's a mental concept, right? So if you think back to Neoplatonism, that puts the importance on the ideas of man, right? That we see Leonardo's interest in rational geometry, balance and symmetry, right? Mathematics and measurement. These are all elements that can be really tied directly to this prominent philosophical movement called Neoplatonism. That's a hallmark of the Renaissance, right? So if we think about, and also the symbolism, perfect symbolism. What better symbolism for Jesus than a triangle? He's part of the Trinity, right? And an equilateral triangle is right, three angles that are the same, that are part of one thing. Three sides that are the same, that are part of one thing, right? Three same things all making up a unit. This is the Christian theology of the Trinity. So it makes sense for Christ to sort of assume this triangular form, right? He's part of a tripartite identity, right? He's one corner of the triangle, if you will. Well, the idea of threes that we see here with the window and Christ is sort of picked up as well throughout, because what we see as we look at the rest of the composition is as Jesus does this, makes this proclamation, what Leonardo's interested in, telling this kind of in human terms, is how did the apostles react to this message? How would you react if the person you're following says, one of you, and you don't know who it is yet, could it be me? One of you is prophesying, right? One of you is going to betray me. And they're all thinking like, could it be me? Right? And so what Leonardo's interested in is this human reaction to Jesus' proclamation. Think about Masaccio, right? We also had that same idea of telling this miracle of the fish with the tribute money, telling that story in human terms, right? Renaissance is the period of humanism, this interest in man. Right? And so Jesus tells this story. He's looking down because he's sad. And all of the apostles are questioning, who's it going to be? Could it be me? Could it be him? And what happens as Christ does this and assumes this triangular form is that the apostles neatly break up into four groups of three, right? And you can see the way he set up the composition. It says, boom, 3, 3, Jesus, 3 and 3. And as you look at the rest of the room, you realize you got the 3 windows on the back, and on the wall you have tapestries, 4 on each wall. So all these 3s and 4s, this mathematical underscoring of the composition, right? And again, math has this mental rationality to the image, right? There are doors between the tapestries. You can barely see them ghost-like there. So there's 3s and 4s on each of the walls. And by the way, the ceiling has what we call coffers, the things you see in the metro, right? And there are 36 of them, 6 by 6. Well, 6 and 6 is 12, and 3 times 12 is, right, is 36. So math sort of is always worked through in a number of sort of interesting ways, right, with this, with the image. So we look at the different apostles, and each one of them, and again, remember the painting's kind of a wreck, is questioning rather eloquently, right, through gesture and facial expression, whether or not they are the ones who might do this. It's tempting to look at, especially the figure in the middle, as embodying Leonardo's interest in sfumato lighting, but that's hard to say because we don't know how it looked in its finished state, right? We just kind of have the staining underneath it without the finishing that he might have brought to it, right? So each one of them is now asking, who could it be? Moving further past the table, it takes place in human terms as they question this concept. The perspective is perfect. We talked about that before, how the perspective extends the space. And we can see, even with the tablecloth and the items on the table, the still life elements are drawn with extraordinary realism, right? Now, which one's Judas, right? He's saying, one of you will betray me, and all 12 of them are still there. So Judas hasn't left yet, right? Can you pick him out? The normal convention with Last Suppers was to put him on the other side of the table. You'd have Jesus and the 11 on one side, because it's all set up sort of like a sitcom, where everybody sits on this side of the table and nobody's got their back to you, right? And the norm was to put Judas on the far side of the table, so he's separated from the other apostles, and that helps to indicate him. But Leonardo's a lot more subtle. Any idea where Judas is? It's tough to tell right away, yeah? Gabrielle? Okay, so here, stop me. Want me to go which way?
Like in
This picture. This guy here. Perhaps. Why do you say him? Because he's sort of turning his back toward Jesus. Good read. Good read, right? Now remember what Christ says. When they say, who's it going to be? He says, it's the one who stops his bread with me. Right? So he takes his bread and dunks it. Right? And there's a very subtle thing that happens, and I'll show you the details in a second. One of them is actually reaching for bread at the very moment, right? So it's sort of telegraphing ahead of time. If we look at the apostles, I like that idea as a way of it's a great logic for that. But if we look at the apostles, we work away from the right. You'll notice that they have a range of facial tones. That's 1, 2, 3. Keep going toward Jesus. 4, 5, 6. Next group off to the left that Dan Brown said was Mary Magdalene, but it's not. Right? Have a group there, and then there's the last group there. In the group off Christ's right hand, on your left, right, you'll notice that one of the 3 is juxtaposed with another one of the 3. One of them has very, very light features, right? That's John, the apostle whom Christ loved, and he always appears more beautiful for that reason. And the guy facing him has incredibly dark features, right? And that's the one we're pretty sure is Judas. And the proof is in what he's doing, and also in how Leonardo conceives of him, which we'll see when we get to a detail, right? But he's the one who's actually reaching for the bread, because remember what Christ says, one of you will betray me. So he's, let's see what's going up next, right? So Christ's hand, if you can see just barely here, is sort of like over here, and is gesturing toward the sop, right, where they're going to dunk the bread. And this figure is actually reaching for it as well. So there's a connection here around that detail that highlights this figure as being Judas. He also is carrying a little wad with him, so this is a betrayal, right? Sort of talked to them. He sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. But look at the difference between John, right, the beautiful apostle, the one who Christ loves, and Judas, who's got this hook nose and big jutting chin, right, and is ugly by comparison, and swarthier by complexion. This goes back to the idea that we saw with the portrait in the National Gallery of Ginevra da Benci. Remember the motto on the back? Beauty adorns virtue, right? The outer form reflects the inner spirit, right? Our inner qualities make us, and we do that. Cinema, right? Bad guys are always ugly, much uglier than the good guys are, right? First Indiana Jones, we remember the fist fight on the plane, big, honking, ugly, bald guy, right? Versus Harrison Ford, who's much more handsome, right? So Judas is represented consciously ugly by Renaissance standards. Because if beauty adorns virtue, what should adorn inner ugliness? Betrayal, a lack of moral character, right? Ugliness. And that same idea is here. Right? So Judas is consciously represented differently. But it's a very subtle thing, because what Leonardo's most interested in with this picture is this conception of sort of bringing together the sort of human side of the story, right? Which is absolutely crucial for him. So he's working now. He's been in Milan 15 years or so when he does this, right? He's been working for the Duke of Milan in what seems to be a really terrific working relationship. He's got lots to do, lots of outlets, not only for his artistic interests, but also scientific. He's talking about diverting rivers for the Duke, help irrigate some fields around Milan. In 1498, Milan is invaded by the troops of the French king. The French army invades Milan, comes across the Alps, and Duke Ludovico Sforza is driven out of the city. Leonardo flees, right? He'd been working for Ludovico Sforza, and he goes back home to Florence, right? And spends the next 5-10 years in Florence after having left Milan behind. And it's when he's back in Florence that he paints her, right? The best known picture in the world, the Mona Lisa. Now her name is Lisa Maria Gherardini, right? And Mona Lisa simply means Lady Lisa, right? So it doesn't, her name ain't Mona. And paints her as probably a commission, most certainly a commission, that's why you do portraits. Maybe a commission given by her husband. We're not 100% sure. There's a lot of mystery that surrounds the Mona Lisa. One of them is that Leonardo kept it for the rest of his life. He never gave it to Lisa Gherardini or to her husband. It stayed in his collection. Eventually he moved to France to work for the king who had expelled the son of the king who had driven Ludovico Sforza out of Milan. He goes to work for him as court artist to the French king. That's where he dies, is working for the French court. And that's why the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre. It's because he took it with him when he went to France. Right? So it was in his possession for the rest of his life. And why he kept it is anybody's guess. Did the patron not like it? That happens, right? When you pay them up front for something, you get what you pay for. And you get the opportunity to say, no, that is not what I want. You can reject it. Was that the possibility? Did Leonardo perhaps not finish it to his own satisfaction? Is there something that he felt was incomplete about it? We don't know. It's a big mystery for us, right? One of the great mysteries surrounding the Mona Lisa. Now we see that it is his preferred format for portraits, which is not just the head and shoulders, but going down and including the hands, right? This is the kind of portrait they likes, and it's the kind of portrait that our little Ginevra da Benci originally was before it was trimmed at the bottom, right? So you can see the degree to which the portrait as it originally stood was very similar in format to the Mona Lisa, with the hands now down at the bottom. We can also see that in the 20 intervening years from Ginevra da Benci to the Mona Lisa, the sfumato has gotten deeper and thicker, right? That smokiness has become more obscuring. So we still have in the background those strange sort of vertical jutting rocks that we saw in the Madonna of the Rocks in the 1480s. But it's very difficult to discern the edges of them, or even how they interact with the water down below. We can see the shadow that they cast across the water, but there's so much that's left to your completion, right? There's so much that's not spelled out that Leonardo wants you to conceptualize in your head. So he's using sfumato everywhere to sort of cloud the transitions between one part of the painting and the other, right? There are hard edges in certain places, the gauzy veil of the Mona Lisa, right? And by the way, the surface of this is a mess. We're afraid to clean off, we, the community, are afraid to even clean off the yellowing varnish for fear that the paint will just chip off of there. Again, Leonardo's goofing around with traditional techniques, right? And it's made this really fragile. This is why when you go see it in Paris, right, you can't get anywhere near it. It's behind bulletproof glass. Right? It was stolen once in 1911. We thought Picasso did it, which is kind of a fun story, right? It went missing in 1911 before they had the bulletproof glass. The sfumato, right, is everywhere, though. So if we look at her hair as it comes down over her shoulders, and you can see this part where it just sort of really disappears into the shadow and then kind of reappears again, and seems almost as if the swirls that we see in her hair are almost translated into the swirls that we see in her robe as well, right? Everywhere things sort of meld in and reappear, foreground to background, even though she's not particularly in any kind of deep shadow, right? He's morphing the forms together through the sfumato, and this adds to the sort of mystery of the figure, because if we look at her face close up, one of the things that makes her sort of so fascinating as an image is the degree to which there are really no lines in her face anywhere, how much is implied rather than delineated, right? Edges of her nose, for example, right? If you were to draw somebody's nose, right, you would usually put a line on it somewhere, but Leonardo understands that there really are no lines in nature, right? And that the nose is a series of graded steps of color. And so nothing is really there. So if you look at the end of her nose, right, and you see from a distance, you read it as a nose. But we come here and realize there's just a line here on the side. And there's not much at all there. Look at her lips. There's no real solid line where the lips actually come together and meet. He's not come back and actually traced a single line through there. But there's that sfumato, right, transition from the upper lip to the lower lip. Even around her eyes, right? Where you would expect to see lines, the creases of the lid, right? Where it meets the, whatever you call it, your brow, right? There's no line there whatsoever, even though there's one that's been implied. And that sort of thing, plus that sort of cockeyed smile, adds to the mystery of the piece, right? It gives her this look like, because you're reading things into it, because you have to read things into it, because Leonardo didn't put them there, he only applied them, that makes it seem as if you have some sort of interaction with her. I've always, my undergraduate prof said, she knows you better than you know yourself. There's something about her gaze and that half smile that suggests that she sort of sees through you and understands you more than you understand her, that she's got the upper hand in it all. The landscape also adds to the mystery. What is this landscape? It's obviously invented, it's obviously fantastic, and it too seems as if it's almost moving and changing in front of our eyes because of this use of sfumato lighting. So we've got some clouds rolling over the horizon on the right. Almost makes it look as if there's a separate horizon line on each side, but it's not. It's just the clouds sort of moving through the hills. And again, we can see some things like this arched bridge. We've seen the detail as well. And some of the water, but at the same time, many of these forms just simply meld into each other and get lost behind the haze, right? And Leonardo loves that. He does it all the time. And part of the point is that you have to participate, that you have to imagine where it is, and that leaves part of the artistic conception still in the mind of man, rather than delineated in the physical world. It leaves it more perfect for this exact reason. And that again fits with Neoplatonism. One of the things that we see here is we see the clouds moving through is it reflects Leonardo's other interests. He did drawings of everything in multiple media, left so many drawings behind. And what he's doing is he's going out, and sometimes he's observing from nature, but most of the time he's kind of taking what he's observed and he's inventing. And one of the things that we see when we look at all of his drawings is the degree to which he's interested in geology and weather and the interaction of these things, how water can break down solid matter, or how solid matter can divert water. And these things kind of reappear in his drawings with great frequency. And as we look at this red chalk drawing of a storm breaking over a valley, we can see that it's not a one-to-one connection to our picture, but there's this interest in the interaction of water and nature that's showing up in the background of the Mona Lisa as well. And another of his drawings, he would just take, these are backwards notes I was talking about, right? They're written right to left because he was a lefty. He was a lefty, and that way he didn't smear his ink. But we have a basin with water pouring into it. How does it swirl, and what happens when you divert a flow of water with different kinds of boards, right? And how then does that appear? But the idea of swirls and water spiraling around when it's deflected, it's almost as if when we look at Leonardo's pictures that everything is water to him. That her robe, as it comes over her shoulder, looks like rivulets of water moving through a conduit, or as her hair comes down off of her shoulders, that you get the same effect. Or even as the path moves its way back into the watery background, where water meets stone, right? You have that same sense that everything is sort of aqueous, everything is liquid, right? And I think that's kind of a fascinating thing because it fits with Leonardo's own personality so far as we know it. And that is that he's so restless. Nature for him is always changing, so you've got to keep going back. Who was the philosopher that said that you could never put your foot in the same river twice? Heraclitus. Anyway, there was a Greek philosopher that said that, and the whole point was that because the river's always moving, right? That since the river's metaphor of constant change, when you put your foot in the river and you pull it back out and you put it back in, it's not the same river because the water has moved on. And Leonardo sort of seems to get that idea, right? That nature is constantly in flux. Nature is constantly changing, and the world is constantly changing, so what I thought I knew about it 5 minutes ago isn't the same now. And I need to look at it again. This is why we make you, in your literature classes, read things that you read in high school, because you're not the same person you were in high school. Right? That works not only for the things in the world that change, but we change too. And I've been teaching Leonardo for, 30 years now, and I don't teach him the same way any 2 semesters running because I'm changing. Right? The river's always changing. And I think Leonardo gets that idea, right? The world is a river that's always changing and merits our complete attention and our returned interest, right? Again and again. We've got a 17th century copy of the Mona Lisa up in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And it's kind of fascinating because the copy is not a bad copy by any means. One of the things that we think Leonardo used it for after he decided to keep it for whatever reason is he used it to teach people how to paint. He had students and they would make copies of them. Right? Lots of copies floating around. There's a really good early one in Spain. But if we look at this one century later or so, 100 years after Leonardo, the nice thing about the copies is they help to highlight what makes the original so good. Right? And we can do this with the Last Supper as well. Right? Compare the real thing we saw here to that little one that's above the dining hall, cruddy little copy. When we look at these two side by side, right? Look at how much more subtle Leonardo's smile is. Like she's got this in the copy, right, compared to Leonardo's. There's all the edges that the copyist brings, right? Render it a little bit more obvious, but don't make it any better. Leonardo also only hints at the architecture. There's a a wall back there behind him, her, and on either side you can see the bottom of a column, the base of a column on either side, right? But the columns aren't there. They're out of frame. And it's not been trimmed down. Those are the original edges of the panel. We know it's never been trimmed. But our copyist decides he's got to fill it in, make it legible. And he also cleans up a lot of Leonardo's sfumato, right? So when we look at copies like this, they can really give us a lot of important information for what made the original work so well, right? And especially when we look at the landscape in the background, the degree to which our copyist has delineated things, right? That it also exists in her face. So Leonardo used his works often for pupils to copy, and this only highlights that fact. Well, like I said, end of his life, around 1510 or so, 1510, 1512, Leonardo leaves Florence and moves to France to become again a court painter. We talked about court painting. He was court painter to the Duke of Milan. He goes around 1510 to become the court painter to King Francis I, Francois Premier. King Francis I of France, who we've got a portrait of, lives in his court, right? He's the court painter living in court. And the interesting thing about this particular gig is that it's very different than his job for the Duke of Milan. For the Duke of Milan, he had a lot of work for him, right? He had paintings, he had geological survey work, sculptural projects. He had lots of things for Leonardo to do as an artist, as an engineer. And he was designing military armaments for the Duke. Right? For Francis I, Leonardo's job was to hang out and be charming. And apparently he was terribly charming. Right? People loved having him around. As you might imagine, he got a lot to talk about. Smart man. But he got on well with people too. Right? He wasn't too highfalutin. And Francis hired him just to be a member of court, just to be there at dinner. Right? Tell stories. Talk. Right? He didn't really do works of art for Francis, so far as we know. No architectural designs, even though he bragged he could do that. No sculptural projects, no frescoes. But he did take the Mona Lisa with him. Right? All the way to France. And this is why it wound up in the Louvre. It's because it was still in Leonardo's possession when he went to France. The Madonna of the Rocks wound up there because the French invaded Milan. Right? And he just took it with him. But Leonardo brought the Mona Lisa with him all the way from Florence when he entered his job. There's a really great anecdote about Leonardo, which I quite like. So we talked about how Leonardo doesn't like drawing things he can't see. We don't do halos on holy figures, right? And he's going to conceive of the Immaculate Conception as being the Madonna sort of emerging from these rocks, right? And it's a very natural way of illustrating a miracle, right? Where Christ has windows as opposed to a halo. Well, there's a story that he was trying to make this drawing of St. George and the Dragon, or a painting of St. George and the Dragon, which would have pleased Francis because Francis belonged to a military order that was dedicated to St. George. And Leonardo was going to draw the dragon, but he doesn't like drawing things he can't see, so he's going to figure out a way to make this work. And he's late for dinner because he's working on these drawings in his chamber, and Francis sends a court servant up, knocks on the door. Leonardo, you're late for dinner. Of course, Leonardo's wrapped up in his studies, and so he's lost track of time, or so the story goes, right? Come down to dinner, this is why you're here at court, is to hang out and entertain. And he finds Leonardo in the midst of making this drawing of a dragon, and says he can't, how do you draw a dragon if you're only going to draw things you can see? Well, what Leonardo did is he caught a lizard, and he caught a bird, and he killed the bird, cut off its wings, and tied him to the lizard with some gold thread, and then strung the lizard up in the from the roof of his studio. So it's there, and he's got these wings tied to it, right? So now I can draw a dragon. Right? HBO, Game of Thrones people would, base their same thing on how do you do a lizard with wings. And this is Leonardo's idea because he was so much interested in the world that he could observe. Right? And I also think it's a fun story to think about Leonardo out there killing birds and getting out a pair of scissors and lop off the wings and then trying his best to tie them to a living lizard, right? So that he can make these drawings of a dragon for a work that never got completed in the first place. So Leonardo is the first of our really strong high Renaissance artists. And oh, by the way, if you've not been, it's easier to see it here, right? And even though I'm a big fan of seeing the physical object, there's really no point, right? If you ever go to the Louvre, right, just around the corner is the Madonna of the Rocks, and there's never a crown like this, right? So we got a chance to see it much more close up than you can even if you go to Paris, right? Because you can't get anywhere near it, right? Wasn't it a Beyonce video last year? Her and Jay-Z were in front of it, right? They were able to clear out they got closer to it than you could. But that's because she's Beyonce and she could do things that the rest of us can't, right? Okay, our next sort of prominent high Renaissance artist is Michelangelo. And it's fascinating to think about. In this town of Florence, which at the time has fewer than 100,000 people, has Leonardo and Michelangelo working in the same city at the same time, right? The Mona Lisa was done while he was back in Florence. Michelangelo is there when he gets back, right? Working primarily in sculpture, but also painting. And the two of them know each other. They have a, I think, somewhat testy relationship. There's one point when they're both working in the same room at the same time, painting frescoes on opposite walls of each other. Right? Both of these have since been lost. The two frescoes have been lost. But they also seem to have argued over the old question of which is a better art, sculpture or painting. Remember that old term we used, the paragone, right? Painters said we can do setting, which for Leonardo is crucial. Sculptors said they can do 3 dimensions, which for Michelangelo is crucial. Right? But the two of them side by side also point with this paragone to a difference between Leonardo and Michelangelo. Even when Michelangelo paints, is that Leonardo sees a connection between figures and this dream world he creates, right? The background of the Mona Lisa adds to our understanding of her. The background of the Madonna of the Rocks adds to our understanding of the Madonna. Michelangelo is interested in the human figure and really nothing else, even when he paints. It's all, his entire message is carried through the body and not at all through the setting. So his David, also certainly one of the most famous works of art ever made, was commissioned by the city of Florence. Okay? It was a civic commission. So the city fathers came to him, asked him to go find a piece of marble. Please carve this for us. Remember that the figure of David, the Old Testament slayer of giants, was used by the people of Florence as their own symbol, right? Because they too had slayed more powerful enemies in battle. So David was their analogy, right? Their allegory. So David was Florence. And we saw before that Donatello, working for the Medici family, that the Medicis had actually co-opted the city's symbol. Now, by the time Florence commissions this from Michelangelo on the left, the Medici had been driven out of Florence. In the 1480s, the Medici had been kicked out. They'd come back again later. But when the city commissions the David from Michelangelo as a return of the symbol to Florence, the Medici have been exiled. Right? So it's the city taking back what was originally theirs. The symbol of David, the giant slayer. And it's a great comparison seeing these side by side because, well, one, the scale is drastically different, right? Donatello's is roughly life size. Michelangelo's is much larger than life size. We'll see in a little bit just how big he is. They both present David nude. We talked about why, right? This is David who works through the power of God in order to achieve this feat. But there's some, and by the way, Michelangelo loves Donatello, and the pose is really quite similar, isn't it? The contrapposto pose that we talked about with the right leg locked, the left leg relaxed, the left arm bent, the right arm down, right, his proper right arm. But there's some differences too that I think are really important for Michelangelo and help us to understand what he's trying to do better. What sorts of differences would you point to? What makes Michelangelo, other than the difference in materials, right? What about how the body looks, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah? Were you starting to raise your hand? Katrina?
I was just saying he's much older.
He seems older, exactly, right? He's no longer this prepubescent teenager, right? Early teens. And how old is hard to say, but certainly old enough to have the world's most perfect body, right? And if we look at the musculature, right, it's still pliable. It's not hard-edged or anything, but he's certainly much more athletic than Donatello's is, right? And there's a sense that Michelangelo understands muscles and how they work together. That's one of the things that makes this work so well. Look at his stomach in particular, his abdominals, right? And there's a sense of, you can tell which ones are more flexed than others, right? On your left, on his right side, as it pinches a little bit, right? You can see those muscles are flexing, and the other ones are sort of stretching out, and the transitions between them are just sort of perfect. And you can see the places where bone comes through behind the muscles as well. He studied anatomy and studied it incredibly closely. So has Donatello, for that matter. But he's choosing a much later moment. Now, this is an interesting thing because he looks like he could do anything, right? Michelangelo's figure, as opposed to Donatello's, has the physical strength necessary to be a giant slayer. You know? You can imagine him getting away with it because he looks so darned athletic. Right? I wouldn't want to go up against him because he's a superhuman figure in a way. So how then can Michelangelo bring to this that same idea that David needs God, that David is a youth? And part of it is the nakedness, which is not accounted for in the story, right? The gratuitous nudity. Okay? But another part is that if you look at his hands, they're extraordinarily large. They're kind of out of proportion to the rest of his body. And that, I think, on a certain level, it's like a puppy dog, you know? So you get a dog in about 6 months, they're sort of the shape they're going to be when they're an adult, but they still have these sloppy paws, you know? This is a very subtle way that Michelangelo makes David still, for all of his development, he's not done developing yet, right? He's going to be even larger still. So the body's different. What else? What other things has he changed from the prototype?
He's not standing on the head of the giant.
The head of the giant is gone, right? There's a lot of little anecdotal details that are gone. The head is the most prominent. But if we add to that the shin guards, right? The hat, those last vestiges of the armor are gone. Now, two things that come out of this, right? The sword. One is that he is more reliant still on God, because he doesn't even have something to protect his legs. There's none of this remnants of clothing only anecdotal detail that we have is the sling over his shoulder. And the hand that's down by Michelangelo's leg has the rock in it. Right? That's the only anecdotal detail. That's the only thing that actually identifies him as David. Right? The head of Goliath helps identify Donatello's as David. But without the sling, Michelangelo's could be anybody. It's a universal figure. Except for the sling, right? And the rock in his hand. So it's a much more subtle way of defining him as David. And it gets rid of these trappings, right? These anecdotal details. Now, without the head of Goliath, it also, in the same way it makes it a generic universal figure, the head of Goliath for Donatello puts this at a very particular moment in the story. Right? He's had the fight. Right? He's thrown the rock, he's knocked him down, he's cut off his head. We know where we are in the story. Is there anything in Michelangelo's figure that tells us where we are in the story? Has he thrown the rock yet? We don't know. Is he just seeing Goliath coming over the hill? Sizing up his enemy? We don't know. Right? It's just as the figure could be almost anybody. Although very few people look like that. Right? So too the time frame could be almost anywhere. It's like it's a what do I want to say? It's a timeless figure. Right? It's not bound by specificity. It's perfect. Right? And again, we go back to this Neoplatonic idea. Specificity, the world, makes things imperfect. Right? So for Michelangelo to lose that specificity makes the figure more perfect. Right? None of these silly little details of story that get in the way of focusing on trying to express everything he thinks about the world through the human body. And nothing else. Anything else you notice is different? We talked about the anecdotal details, the quality of the musculature. Anything else? What about facial expressions? We talked about Donatello's facial expression. He's got this kind of aloof. He doesn't really show any emotion whatsoever, right? He's twiddling with the bloody beard of Goliath with his toes, which is disgusting. And yet his face is like, oh, right? Aloof and unaffected by what's going on. Would you say the same for Michelangelo? Let's take a look at Michelangelo's face. He's got a fairly fierce expression. Brow is furrowed. From different angles, it looks somewhat different. Sometimes he looks very determined in our slide on the left. Sometimes he looks slightly worried in our slide on the right. There's a fierce inner determination in Michelangelo's figure that we didn't really have with Donatello. It's a very different kind of emotion that he's bringing to it. And it's this idea that for Michelangelo, when we talk about what ideas is he trying to traffic in, what kind of ideas is he trying to get across, for him, the human body, right, is this house for the soul. And this derives from Neoplatonic ideas that Michelangelo is steeped in. He hung out with Lorenzo de Medici. He used to hang out at the Medici Palace at that Neoplatonic Academy when he was a kid back in the 1480s, right? And as a teenager. And was very much steeped in these ideas of the metaphysical world, right? Things that don't exist but we can think about. And the physical world, which are things that do exist, right? And that's part of Neoplatonic thinking, is that one is a higher plane of thinking, is a more perfect vision. The other is cluttered by the world around us. And for Michelangelo, the human body should try to reflect on some level that metaphysical soul that we all have inside of us, rather than just flesh and blood, the life inside of us. So he wants that the body to not look like an individual's body. He wants the body to look like something that's extraordinary and perfect. And that then reflects for him the soul that's inside of it. And the other part that reflects that soul that's inside of it is the face. Right? Is the way in which the inner sort of angst, if you will, of the figure of a soul that's trapped, even in a perfect body, still trapped on earth, longs for a return to outside of this world, to the metaphysical world. And that anxiety of being trapped inside of a body, of a soul trapped in the earth, right? The Neoplatonic idea, stuck here on this planet, longing to be free. That's an idea Michelangelo plays with a lot. And the image of his face being angry fits with the story, right? He's seen Goliath probably. Maybe he's knocked him down already. We don't know. But somewhere in that story, right, is that grim determination. But at the same time, it also reflects what Michelangelo is trying to bring into this, which is his own interests in the relationship between the soul and the world, expressed through the human body. Right? That's sort of Michelangelo's motif that he returns to. So, commissioned by the city, right? Where did they want it to go? Originally, it was going to go on one of the buttresses of the cathedral in Florence. And about 10 years ago, what with 3D printers and all, they put a copy up there for a little while so you could see where it was originally intended to go. And the city fathers, when they came to see what he had done, said, this is, we can't put it, out over there somewhere. And they moved it right in front of City Hall, where a copy still stands today, right? But the fact that it was originally intended to be seen about 60 feet up in the air accounts for the scale of the figure, which, if you've never seen it, blows you away when you're there. I mean, there's nothing within our little detail on the left that suggests its scale, but you realize that a normal human comes up to his knees, right, if they were to stand at his feet. It's extraordinarily huge and dominates the world around it, right? And this is, again, I think for Michelangelo is a really important idea, that the human body dominates everything. Right? Well, up to this point we've been talking about Florence, primarily about Florence, and artists that are working in Florence. In 1505, the Pope in Rome, back up, around 1430, they started to work out the Papal Schism. Remember we talked about the Papal Schism, right? Where in the early 14th century, right, the popes moved to France to be under the direction of the French king at Avignon, right? That continues all the way through the early 15th century, and it's around the 1430s or so that the popes relocate back to the Vatican in Rome. Okay? And they only begin to become major art patrons in the 1460s, 1470s. Right? By which time the Renaissance is in pretty full swing. Right? As we move into the High Renaissance, the popes become even more active in commissioning works of art. And we start to see the Renaissance, which was really growing in Florence, be imported into Rome. Right? So in 1505, it's a 3-hour train ride, right? But it was a day's ride by horse. 1505, the Pope in Rome, Julius II, sends a messenger to hire Michelangelo. He's got work for him to do, right? And it probably has to do with the fame of the David statue, right? Word got around that this guy can do this extraordinary thing, right? Massive scale, and can pull it off. And Julius has got ideas. Julius is rebuilding Rome. He wants to leave his mark on the city. And he's actually arguably the most important figure in the Italian High Renaissance, because he gives Michelangelo great things to do. And he's got a number of projects that he's working on about redesigning Rome, some of which are huge, unthinkably huge. And at the same time, as he wants to leave his mark on Rome, he also wants to leave behind the most beautiful tomb that anyone has ever had. And he's got this in the back of his mind that he wants it. And when he hears about Michelangelo, he goes, there's my man. To design a tomb for me that will be greater than any tomb any pope has ever had. And that's Michelangelo's first job, right? He goes to Rome to work on the tomb of the Pope Julius II. And he begins by just doing sketches, right? And a lot of them are probably for presentation, to talk to Julius about what he wants, right? And it's going to be a monster project. And it keeps morphing and developing it as he stops and he goes back and he works on it, right? At one point, it's something like 30 over life-sized figures. Like each of the figures are around 8 or 9 feet tall, and 30 of them in a house-like structure. Usually, they are all working with the same metaphor we talked about with the David, which is that at the bottom you have bodies that are trapped, right? The soul trapped in the body. And as we move up, the spirit gets loose, right? The spirit rises toward heaven. That's the theme he keeps working back and forth with. And so if you look at the drawing on the right, you can see that all the bodies on the bottom are sort of tied up like captives. They've got their arms bound behind their backs, right? Because this is a metaphor for the soul chained to the earth, right? And then up above, they begin to gesture out as the soul breaks free, right? So this is why Michelangelo comes to Rome, fall of 1505. Is Pope Julius has called for him because he wants him to work on one of a number of projects for him. And Michelangelo keeps going to it and coming back to it. And here's one of the completed sculptures that was originally planned for the Julius tomb. Right? And these slaves are the body, or excuse me, the soul enslaved in the body, right? Bound to the earth. So it looks like a tank top, doesn't it? But he's got a strap around his neck, or his chest, I mean. And he's sort of given up struggling anymore. Right? It never got finished. He kept coming back to it for decades. 20 years after Julius's death, Michelangelo is still working on the tomb. Right? Michelangelo lives to be about 90. Right? But Julius dies 1519, 1517, right in there. When he never finishes it, that means there's a lot of sculptures laying around that were planned to go with the tomb, but are no longer in as part of the plan. So they get sold. Highest bidder. Francis I, who hired Leonardo, loves Italian art. He bought these. And this is in the Louvre as well. Right? These are how they came to be there. Francis loves Italian art. Right? But as Michelangelo goes to work on it, stops, goes back to work on it again, he leaves these in various states of completion. And some of them become really fascinating. I mean, I think in a way almost better for being unfinished. Because there's a sense with this metaphor of the soul that's trapped in the body. Michelangelo translates, and he writes about this too, he translates into the idea of, for him, sculpture is a body trapped in stone. And Michelangelo's job is to free it by chipping it away. Right? Free the body from the thing. And he said that he could look at any piece of stone and he could imagine the body that was in it already. And his job was just to get rid of the stuff that the earth put there and got in the way. Right? To free this thing out of it. See how these Neoplatonic ideas really wrap up in all of this? Right? So we see the practice here. He's beginning to free the body, but there's this sense that it's trapped and struggling and trying to come out of that stone almost as Michelangelo's freeing it. And we can see that certain parts are more polished and finished, but some parts are really rough. And it almost looks like he's supposed to have hair on his chest between his pecs, but it's where he hasn't smoothed it off yet. And look especially at his beard and his face, and you can see it's just barely roughed into it, right? As Michelangelo's carving away. And he tended to work from one side only, and work toward the back from one side. He said that the way he sculpted was like he said he imagined sculpture to be a body laying in a bathtub full of water. And his job was to pull the plug. Right? And the water would go and reveal the body underneath it, right? And you can see that's kind of what he's doing here, is he's pushing his way backward from one side, which is kind of extraordinary to think about, isn't it? To imagine as you're chipping away that you're going to stop here, right? You're going to stop there, rather than working in from all sides at once. So we're left with a lot of these sculptures that are simply unfinished, but I think Michelangelo kind of liked them this way. We certainly like them this way. And we can also talk about how this relates to Neoplatonism, right? Leonardo uses sfumato, so, Mona Lisa's hair becomes the landscape. Ginevra da Benci becomes the juniper plant, right? And your mind completes it. Your mind fills in what your eye can't see. Michelangelo's doing the same thing with sculpture, right? You imagine the rest of the figure that he hasn't yet freed from the stone. The hand inside that block, right? The figure's proper right hand. Or the left arm behind his head. It's also still mills. You can see where it is. You can see where it's going. That the stone becomes for Michelangelo what the smoke became for Leonardo. Right? Was this place where things emerge. So if he finishes it, I think for Michelangelo this is a tough thing, right? The David's all great. There's nothing wrong with the David, except that it's finished. Right? Because once it's finished, then the idea becomes physical, and that, I think, becomes a little problem. And leaving things unfinished allows it now to be this more ideal form from the philosophical standpoint that Michelangelo was coming from, which is that ideas are more perfect than physical things. But that is a conflict for him, because he's a sculptor. He makes physical things. So, he leaves these things unfinished. He seems to appreciate them as unfinished works. He never actually finishes the tomb until around 25 years after Julius is dead. This is the final Julius tomb. You can go visit it in Rome with various figures. The only ones that are entirely by Michelangelo is this image of Moses down below. But many of the rest of them are based on his designs. This one might be by him as well. Right? In the San Pietro in Vincoli is where it is. It's where Julius' tomb is. But it's nowhere near what he, it's huge. You stand about that tall. Right? But it's nowhere near this huge house with 30 figures that was part of some of the original scheme. So for Michelangelo, the Renaissance becomes this sort of great unfinished symphony in a way. Right? Now, part of leaving it unfinished, part of never completing the Julius tomb, was Julius's fault. Right? The Pope himself kept pulling Michelangelo off the project and giving him other stuff to do. Right? He had big ideas for projects in and around Rome, and Michelangelo was a huge part of that because he was so talented. And so part of the reason he doesn't finish the Julius tomb during Julius's lifetime is that Julius pulls him off and sticks him here. Right? The Sistine Chapel ceiling. The chapel was built under Pope Sixtus some 50 years earlier, but the ceiling only had a field of stars. And he decides he wants to redesign this with pictures. Right? So as Michelangelo's working on his tomb, he says, come on, we're not going to finish this anytime soon. I need you to do this instead. Right? And a lot of people think, I think this might even be in the worksheet, that the figures that appear on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel are ideas that Michelangelo was working on as he designed the tomb. Knowing that he's probably never going to finish the tomb. Who could, right? He's going to work those ideas out instead in paint through the different figures that appear here. So Julius is really driving this, right? Really very much driving the Renaissance, driving Michelangelo's work in Rome is determined primarily by his patron, by Julius II. And one of Julius's projects, probably his single biggest project, is not his tomb or the Sistine ceiling. Right? his single biggest project, which seems outlandish anymore, is he's going to rebuild St. Peter's. So, the Church of St. Peter's, right, the Cathedral of St. Peter's, was built back in the early 300s, right around 310, 320, by the first Roman emperor who adopted Christianity, Constantine the Great. And what Constantine did when he adopted Christianity, he did it as a way to bring the Roman Empire together. And the first thing he decided to do, one of the first things he decided to do, was to begin to build monuments marking the major Christian sites within the Roman Empire. And Christians are already going to the grave of St. Peter. They're already going to the place where Christ was born. They're already going to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He erects churches in all these places so that the worshipers have a place to go. Right? And so St. Peter's marks the grave of St. Peter in Rome. It's the graveyard where Peter was buried. And they've done excavations, and they actually, with some credibility, we think we found it. Right? We found part of his body. You can go see it. The original church by Constantine that was built here in the early 4th century is the bit in the bottom. Right? It's just this part here is the original Constantinian church. And it had been standing for 1,200 years. Right? Julius decides it isn't big enough. And he wants to tear it down and rebuild it. So he begins to build over the top of it. And the archway that you see here is the new St. Peter's. And the massiveness of this project is part of Julius's aspiration, right? And Michelangelo's going to fit into that as well. Because as you might imagine, he's never going to finish this either. It was under construction still when Julius was dead, right? This drawing is by a Dutch artist who visits. We can see the constructed St. Peter's going up over the top of the old St. Peter's. It's not finished anytime soon. It, again, won't be finished until the 1560s or so. Michelangelo eventually designs the dome that goes over the top of it, right? So we're looking sort of this way in our drawing through the nave. The dome ain't there yet. It would have gone over the top of that. And that's also by Michelangelo's design because he's wrapped up in all elements of this project of rebuilding Rome in the Renaissance. So it started by Julius II. He's got big ideas, right? He's got lots of work for Michelangelo. The ceiling, his tomb, work on St. Peter's as well, right? This just barely scratches the surface. None of it is really finished in Julius's own lifetime. His dreams exceed his means, which fits with Neoclassicism, doesn't it? Like, our ideas should be bigger than the things that we can do. Push yourself further. Okay, we'll wrap up the Renaissance on Monday. Today's Thursday, right? Please, God. Okay, so on Monday we'll wrap up the Renaissance. And again, remember Monday your next 2 worksheets are due, and today your bibliography is due, so make sure you get that in to me by email, right? Also make sure you, Mac users, save it as a Word document, right? When you send it to me.